Daily.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello and welcome to the first Cross Question of 2025. It's 8 here on LBC. On the panel with me today, we have Polly Billington sitting to my left, Labour MP for East Thanet. Next to her, Conservative peer Kulveer Ranger. To my right, Alison Phillips, columnist for the New Statesman, former editor of the Daily Mirror. And next to her, Freddy the deputy editor of the Spectator and editor of its US edition, Spectator World. So they're here to answer your questions. If you'd like to ask them a question, the number to call 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on that number, or you can text 84850.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first questioner. It's Robbie in Chelmsford. Hello, Robbie.
Hello all, Happy New Year. My question is a two-parter. Do the recent provocative interventions from Elon Musk hurt or help Starmer and Farage, given Musk's own lack of popularity with the British people? And how might the UK tackle his misinformation effectively?
Polly.
Thank you very much, Iain. First of all, I wouldn't take any notice of him if I absolutely had to. I think he's getting far too much attention. And what I think is interesting about people who do spread misinformation, I've done lots of work on this in relation to a whole load of conspiracy theories and so forth, is that they're not really interested in the victims in this circumstance. And what we need to be focused on, particularly the government ministers and so forth, is tackling the scourge of child sexual exploitation and cracking down on that, acting on the recommendations of previous inquiries and making sure that we are keeping young people safe.
Is there anything that can be done about it? I mean, apart from ignoring him, which, I mean, we spent the last hour talking about him on the programme.
Well, that's your prerogative.
I know,
I certainly might ignore
and I
if I want
did go
to.
through a bit of sort of mental anguish about this, thinking, well, shouldn't we just ignore him? But when the world's richest man starts talking about toppling a democratically elected government, you can't really ignore that, can you?
Well, I suppose the thing is, what you need to do is to go always to the facts. And I think one of the important things I just heard you before we started, we are a democratic country. Decisions are made on the basis of who people vote for. We have a good cycle of elections. People can make just decisions about who is in charge or not. And that is the process that we go through. And he's not just trying it here, he's trying it elsewhere. Yeah. I think the thing is, he's also as I understand it, he's going to be an appointed government official in the US. The US also has a strong democratic tradition, and it has an enormous number of checks and balances. We would like to make sure that those institutions are protected and safe in order to make sure that the United States continues to be a free country. We know those things are not ever always a given, and I think we always need to be eternally vigilant in these circumstances, especially when individuals decide to throw around accusations and so forth, frankly, in order to attract attention to themselves rather than to solve any problems.
Freddie, you edit the US edition of The Spectator. I mean, maybe pick up on what Polly has said there.
Well, I mean, your caller asked whether it hurts or helps the politicians involved, Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage. I think it really helps them in a sort of news cycle sense. Keir Starmer would rather be talking about Elon Musk and the danger of Elon Musk rather than trying to defend his rather ropey reforms of the NHS.
Would you?
No, absolutely not. I was just going to say, it's been driving us up the wall all day. It was actually what we really wanted to talk about. Was it exactly that elective care? Was making sure that we've got more money?
Why does he allow himself to be distracted by it then?
Well, because in the press conference this morning, there was absolutely that needed to be dealt with, and particularly the stuff about child sexual exploitation. That's the important thing. He was not.
And that was all on his autocue as well.
I was not interested in talking about the interventions of misinformationists and conspiracy theorists. He was interested in making sure that he defended his record on child abuse and talked about the reforms of the NHS.
Freddy.
Well, let's talk about reform a little bit then. I spoke to some senior people in the Reform Party today, and they saw it as a Clause 4 moment for the Reform Party, where they did get to sort of distinguish themselves and Tommy Robinson, and by picking a fight with Elon Musk, it's a good thing for them. So I think we should all just calm down a bit about the fact we're talking about Elon Musk. It doesn't really matter whether we're talking about him or not. He's not a grave threat to British democracy. He owns a media platform, a very important
He's dominated the news cycle for nearly a week.
Well, as discussed at the beginning, that's down to us, isn't it? I don't think it really matters.
Alison?
I think it does matter, because I think what we're seeing with Elon Musk is it may be that Keir Starmer and others don't want to talk about him, and I'm sure actually Keir Starmer would far rather been speaking about the NHS reform, because we know that is why so many people voted for Labour at the last election. It was the number one factor.
Exactly.
But however, you cannot ignore Elon Musk, I don't think, in this situation, because what we see in this kind of right-wing, far-right, whatever you want to call it, populist agenda, part of that is around this sense that they don't want us talking about this, and this is a common theme that comes. And you look at people like Tommy Robinson, who's built his whole appeal on the idea that they don't want this to be discussed. So it has to be brought out in the open. I actually thought Keir Starmer was perhaps at his finest since he got the job today, because he sounded believable, authentic, and he didn't just brush it off. He actually went into quite a lot of detail as to why what Elon Musk was said was A, not true, and B, very, very damaging, because we have to be aware that on social media there are people who do want to undermine our democracy here and elsewhere. And the only way, really, there's a lot of work being done about how do you communicate most effectively when you have populists out there for attention. And the way to do that is to be nuanced, to be sensible, not to be hysterical, but to explain situations as they are and hope that you can take people with you.
But doesn't that slightly tap into my point? That Keir Starmer is much more comfortable talking about this than about his government's record. It's an easy win for him to say, "Oh, we're not going to let this." Far
Freddie,
right.
I don't know what you're talking about a record. We've been in for 6 months, and what we were talking about was our plans in order to be able to reform and improve the NHS.
Okay.
And that's something that we were actually very, very keen on talking about. I think you're right, Alison, that he was very comfortable because he was defending. Then he was actually defending his record as Director of Public Prosecutions, the first person to prosecute an Asian grooming gang, because he could see that there were cultural sensitivities that were being used to avoid these kind of prosecutions, changing the guidelines on victims so that they could dispel some of the myths about what constituted a proper victim, and being able to give us the opportunity as a country.
On these things
I think it's important to start saying, because Alison's right, he was defending his record on that as well as wanting to talk about the NHS.
I think Robbie asked the impact on Starmer and Farage by Musk making this intervention. And I think the way they both responded is it's almost risen their stock as politicians. They've been able to come out and defend, as Polly's been saying, and Freddy highlighted, and even I said, themselves. Farage has demonstrated that he's not going to be bullied by a billionaire in terms of doing or saying whatever he wants to say. And Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, has set out his views on this in the context of everything else he's doing in the country. And I think that shows our politicians in a good light, actually.
And Kemi Badenoch has missed a trick, hasn't she?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think she got praised by Elon Musk for one reason or another. But this is, I think we have to take on board that the world is changing. And I know, Polly, you'd like it to be a different world where different things could be spoken about and politicians have their policies. And we all, whenever we're wanting to get our message out, want a clear run at it. But things come in, and there are always disruptors in the world, and people like Elon Musk exist. And for me, my son knows who Elon Musk is and talks about him. He's 6.
Well,
so in our home, we refuse to bring up Elon Musk. My wife and I stopped trying to say it, to not overemphasise. But this is the world we're living in, where influencers, billionaires, people are changing society, and our politics has to be robust enough to deal with the challenges that are coming in from people like this. And I think that this is a real moment for our politics to see how do we deal with an intervention like this, because they're not going to stop. They're going to keep coming.
But Kemi Badenoch could have done what Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer have done, but instead she played into Elon Musk, didn't she?
I think Kemi Badenoch has said, well, let's see where things go. She's at this point doesn't need to wade into the argument with Elon because...
But she did.
I'd say on the contrary, Ian, I'd say that Kemi Badenoch, I'm no great fan of Kemi Badenoch, but I think on this, she's not directly engaging with Musk on Twitter. She's doing what a politician should do, which is talking about the political issue, whereas the others are getting sucked into, a Twitter sphere spat. And I think that's what politicians should not be involved in online trolling, which is essentially what Elon Musk is doing. And Elon Musk wants that reaction from Keir Starmer. He wants that reaction from Nigel Farage. He's having fun because it's good for engagement, and that's good for Twitter.
But I thought it was completely the opposite. I thought Kemi Badenoch has made a really obvious attempt to try and win favour with Elon Musk at the very point where Nigel Farage is falling out of favour. I think she's done herself absolutely no favours at all. And in fact, the party that is already struggling under her leadership, I think this could be an absolutely critical point where lots of people who've been sort of thinking, Conservative reform, which way shall I go? There's now a very good reason for them to go to reform and away from the Conservatives.
Well, to be fair to her, she was engaging in the argument, saying, well, I believe there should be a national inquiry as opposed to...
I didn't for one moment believe she was engaging in the argument. I felt, because if she had been, then we all know that when she was Equalities Minister or Minister for Women, she could have done something then if she really cared about...
But she didn't.
But she didn't do anything at all at that point. She's shown absolutely no interest in this issue
until it didn't come under her department.
But at no point has shown any interest in this until Elon Musk has made it an issue.
See, I think Farage ended up looking somewhat foolish. I watched him on Koonsberg yesterday, and he described Elon Musk as both a hero and cool. And within 24 hours, he looks like an absolute fool because he didn't stick exactly with the line of his would-be
Well, he looks a fool because he's changed his mind.
Well, in
the way that Keir Starmer has about 20 times since he's been leader on all sorts of things.
That's a cheap shot.
It was, but true.
But no, the point is that he found that having danced to Elon Musk's tune all over last summer and so forth, he found that he deviated from his position once, and then he found that he's fallen out with him. That's what happens when you play with fire. Really.
So you aren't actually willing to give Farage any credit for calling him out for what he is?
Well, I'm just saying that he looked very foolish for a very long time.
All right. A follow-up question from Ed in Los Angeles, who says, do you think Elon Musk is a threat to national security in the UK? And if you do, what does that mean? Freddie?
No, I don't think he's a threat to national security.
Even though he says he'd like to topple the elected government?
Yeah, but don't take him seriously. I mean, he doesn't take himself seriously. You know, I mean, that tweet about should the US liberate the UK from its tyrannical government was obviously sort of set to go out at 7:10 and to cause a national discussion, which of course it has done. Elon Musk is interested in Britain. He calls us the motherland, apparently. He's interested in British politics, but he's not an expert on British politics. I mean, I think his understanding of what's going on the right is a little bit squiffy. I don't think he's a national security threat.
There's another word which should be reintroduced in the English language.
I don't think he's a threat to national security, certainly not British national security.
Alison?
I think we don't... I mean, obviously, at first glance, he doesn't appear to be, but words have consequences. So you look at what he said about Jess Phillips, which was horrendous, and now we've heard that the police are investigating a man that made threats to Jess Phillips. Jess Phillips, who was close friends of Joe Cox, who was murdered in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. We also saw David Amess. There are people out there who want to attack and want to kill our politicians, and they're quite often motivated by things they read on social media and elsewhere. And so anybody who posts anything, yes, we all believe in free speech, but anybody who posts this kind of content has got to think there could be consequences of it.
So effectively, he's giving licence to people to do wicked things.
Well, we also know in the riots that we had in the summer how much of that was provoked and promoted on social media platforms. This is all coming from somewhere, and it breeds this sort of sense. And yes, we do not know in the longer term. We also don't know in the longer term quite what Elon Musk is up to. Why is so much sent across the whole of Europe?
I've got to say, what are we blaming here? Are we blaming social media? Are we blaming Elon Musk? You know, we had riots. I remember when I was at City Hall in 2011 and there were riots, and we all started blaming BlackBerry because it was the BlackBerry system that we couldn't get into. There are always going to be agitators. I know, the BlackBerries, the red light flashing away at you. But there's always going to be some platform. There's always going to be something. Now, if we start saying, well, we can't have that, we can't have, the social media side, or we have to stop them saying these things, I don't think that's the right way to go. And I think we start entering into that free speech conversation. We start entering in where people can have their platforms to say things. Elon Musk is saying what many people might say. Yes, he has power, and yes, he has influence, and I think he knows that We all know that. So if we have to be slightly better educated when we take that in, and it helps people to become a bit more informed and a bit better to understand what's happening, I actually think that's a good thing. I think we have to be conscious of people like Elon Musk, be aware of what they're doing, and educate ourselves and our children and other people about what's coming and how we're going to have to deal with it going forward.
Which would be great in an ideal world, but the reality is lots of people aren't educated about this sort of thing. They believe, we know increasing numbers of people are believing things they read on social media platforms, and it's not this open playing field. There are algorithms which are stacked to ensure that some people read more of the hate-filled content, and that those vulnerabilities are played upon, and it's not a level playing field.
But I think just that utopian world of a level playing field won't exist. There will always be algorithms. It's actually, I think, what Elon Musk has done has opened people's eyes to what he could do. You know, suddenly he said he was friends with Farage and now he's attacking him, and it causes that discussion to debate the purity of, Musk is right and Farage is right. No, they're having an argument. Okay. I think it helps people to understand the debate and the discussion.
Final word from you, Polly?
Oh, well, on whether he's a threat. I think there is some value in being very, very. I think it's all very well talking about sort of a kind of rational Socratic dialogue, and as though we all got more educated by some troll kind of throwing vile stuff out across the internet. I don't think that's the case. I think we do need to understand, and what the big difference is between him and our traditions here is that he is a free speech absolutist, and we understand that free speech, although we might very well be and rightly enthusiastic about it, we also recognise that it needs to be qualified in order to be able to protect people and protect actually the freedoms that we're talking about. And I think that's the difference. And that if we get to a point where everybody, that the absolutism that he's talking about would actually permit all kinds of things, which would end up exacerbating the thing that he says he's trying to, he's accusing others of having let rip.
OK, we have lots of time for more questions. So if you'd like to phone in, 0345 6060 973, you can WhatsApp a question on that number too. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
You're listening to or watching Cross Question. Alison Phillips is here, columnist for the New Statesman. Freddie Gray, deputy editor of the Spectator. Polly Billington, Labour MP for East Thanet. Have you found your feet yet, Polly? You've been there 6 months.
I'm getting to grips with it. The first 3 months were really hard without an office, without any staff, without all that kind of stuff. And that sounds like a big whinge, but it was really, really hard when people sort of expect you to kind of come out fully formed as a member of Parliament. But now things are settling down, and I think the really important thing for us as MPs is you get to grips with the fact that there is legislation going through the chamber, and you need to be there, you need to be scrutinising it, you need to be asking questions, you need to be contributing to the debates, and that's when you recognise that's the thing that you're there for, that's the difference, that's the thing that you can do that only you can do, particularly for your constituents.
And you're sort of poacher-turned-gamekeeper, aren't you? Because you used to do this job.
I used to ask
political correspondent on the radio.
Yes, I did, yeah. And also, obviously, I was a special advisor. I used to spend my time being the worst possible questioner in order to be able to prepare my bosses for the interrogation of people like you. Yeah, so I've had a bit of practice.
And Kulveer Ranger is here, Conservative peer. Now, it must seem a long time ago when you were working for Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London. I'm just reading that chapter, all those chapters in his autobiography at the moment.
Yes, it does, although he did ring me up in the middle of, I think, the period when he was writing it to say, "Oh, Ranger, I've got a question." And then he said it'd only take a minute, and I had the kids in the car. We were about to shoot off, so I thought I'll just answer this. An hour later, I was still on the phone to him reminiscing about those City Hall days. No, it was 2008 to 2012. Yeah. I feel like they were halcyon days for this city of London.
The way he writes about it, they certainly were.
Well, I tell you what, people look back now and sometimes they say that as well. It was challenging personally, I have to say. Huge. I look back at it, it was a huge job to look after transport, had the environment digital, but it was focused on getting things done. I feel immensely proud still of what we got done for London. The bikes, the buses, yes, Crossrail, yes, the Olympics. But it was the feel, there was an energy, and it came from him, I have to say. He is that kind of politician. He drives that unique brand, Boris, which worked as mayoralty, for the mayoralty. After that, I wasn't working for him, so I won't comment on that. But it was a great time, Ian.
I just want more of your Boris impression. I thought
I spent enough time asking him questions and preparing him as much as I could. So it rubs off on you.
Let me go to our next question. It's from Lisa in Bromsgrove, who says, "Are the winter fuel and inheritance tax changes and also the Waspy decision worse than Partygate?" Well, a new poll commissioned by LBC has suggested a majority of people think those three decisions have all been worse for this government than Partygate was for the Conservative government. It also suggested that a quarter of people who voted Labour last summer now regret having done so. Alison.
No, I don't think that those three things are worse than Partygate in terms of the breach of trust that happened, I think, between the people and government at that time. I was on the Mirror at that point when we broke those stories about Partygate, and it was truly shocking, I think, as it came out, and people really felt that the bleakest time in our recent history that they had been cheated and they'd been lied to by the people that were making
But what's the difference
laws.
Here? Because people say, well, they didn't say anything about the winter fuel allowance in the manifesto.
If they had come out before the election and said, you will keep your winter fuel allowance forever and ever and ever, then I think that might be acceptable. And I don't think that they should have got rid of the winter fuel allowance. I think that was a mistake at that point. I think it's probably a mistake at any point. It was definitely a mistake at that point. But I don't, if I'm honest, think it was on the same scale as that breach of trust. And then the line about the quarter of people are regretting it. I think we're 6 months in. It was a bit of a wobbly start. I think a lot of people voted for the government because they wanted to get rid of the last lot. So I don't think that's quite as disastrous as perhaps it might be perceived in some quarters, and I think they've got a year to kind of regain that ground.
When Pepper Crerar came to you and said, "Editor, I've got this story, they've been having parties in Downing Street," do you remember what your reaction was?
Yeah, but the strange thing was, at that point, I don't think any of us realised quite the ramifications it was going to have in the first instance, because it was just as we were going into the following Christmas. It was the beginning of that December, and people were starting to talk about Christmas parties again. And then Pippa said, "Yeah, we think there was one party to start with." And of course, once we did that one story, and initially even that didn't get picked up the next morning. I was terribly disappointed that it hadn't even made it onto the news programmes that morning, and then it got mentioned at PMQs that lunchtime, and then gradually there was a snowball. And I think it was just the general sense of anger that ordinary people had who hadn't been able to go to their parents' funerals, they hadn't been able to do all those things, and then they realised how they'd been cheated.
Kulveer Ranger, can you see the comparison here?
No, not really, because, look, breach of trust is a breach of trust with the electorate. And when, I think Alison says this government's had a bit of a wobbly start. That's a real understatement, I would say, to come in with such a whopping great big majority and with goodwill behind you and to fritter that away that quickly. When we compare it to COVID and Partygate, there was a build-up of frustration of what the country and people were having to go through that led to that situation, and then it was, played out through what the people considered was wrong, and it was wrong. But this is a culmination of a number of promises that were made to people that they would be doing, especially around things like the sort of waspy standing with every kind of cause and the cabinet members, shadow cabinet members saying we'll support these women, we'll do this. That promise to say we'll support you, people take away and say, right, I'm going to lend you my vote because you're going to support me on this when you get power. That's the transactional agreement that's being made with a citizen and the politician. And the direct breach of that in how we've seen it, that for me, I think, particularly will damage the government in a much more longer term way, because they've got to regain that trust by doing more, and they're already at a sort of low ebb. And then I think the winter fuel allowance, that was just, yes, it's bad politics, but it's also why not build your narrative, say what you're trying to do rather than this one-off hit. And I know the government say, well, we wanted a quick win, but that just doubles down on it. Oh, so it's a quick win to damage the pensioners and those who can't afford it. So it's been one after the other, and it's felt like breach of trust, and the public. And that's why the government and Sir Keir Starmer's ratings are so low at the moment. And I think, someone said earlier that it'll take this year, we're going to come back. Well, it's just not that easy, because every time you take a step forward, anything else that happens is 2 steps back, because you're already on the back foot. So I think there's a massive job for the government to do in getting that back. And I think the only way they'll do this, and I say this to any politician, whoever they are, whichever party, is deliver things now. Deliver things for the people. You've spoken about growth. Growth was the number one thing that this government said they will do. Everything they've done so far has hindered growth. And, we can see that in the stats and everything we're hearing about the growth projections. So do things now that actually deliver and make things better, rather than saying, there'll be another mission, there'll be another milestone and another review happening.
Polly.
Look, I think the thing is that people actually want a government that is seen to be fair. And I think that was the big damaging thing of Partygate. People felt that there was one set of rules for them and another set of rules for those people in Downing Street. And that was the big breach of trust. We have been very clear that we want to be able to re-establish some kind of trust on that. And what has been very difficult for us is, because of the economic situation that we've found ourselves in, we have had to make difficult decisions. However, we are focusing on making sure that those are as fair as possible. For example, protecting the very poorest pensioners from that decision about winter fuel payments. And when it comes to...
But wouldn't you say a pensioner who's on £12,000 a year is not well off?
Yeah, and also making sure that we've got the protections for that. So there's the Warm Homes Grant, there's the Warm Home, there's the Household Support Fund and so forth, in order to be able to make sure that we make sure that there is help for those people. Overall, we've also got good commitments on the pensions overall, with triple lock and so forth. And also making sure that when it comes to things like WASPI, which did feel like an injustice, overall, what the Ombudsman was recommending was a £10 billion commitment to a whole lot of women, most of which probably knew what was going on. And that means that basically people will say, yes, it was unfair, but it's very difficult to justify spending that amount of money on that number of people.
Which is fair, but that's not what Rachel Reeves, Liz Kendall, I don't know whether you had your photo taken with this placard, but they all did.
We all thought it was unfair. But we also know that we've got to make some decisions on whether that is a good spent investment.
Yeah, but you didn't say that before the election. That's
money.
The point.
No,
that's where Kulveer's point about trust comes in.
Yes, I know, but this is also when you find a situation which is much worse than you expected it to be, and that was what was really difficult about the winter fuel allowance. Making that decision in July. And when I had those conversations with my colleagues in the Treasury, and I was like, well, why are you doing it now? They said, because we need to do it now, because the black hole is this year. So if we don't do it this year, we will end up falling back.
And you or none of your colleagues said to them, yes, but why didn't you put 2p on a litre of petrol?
Oh, well, you know how popular that would go down.
Well, nothing's ever going to be popular, but at least it would be fairer than
I don't know whether
punishing
it would be.
poor pensioners.
I don't know whether it would be fairer, to be honest, if you put 2p on petrol, bearing in mind how many people are entirely dependent on using the roads in our rural areas.
Right,
and
think of something else, but there are other ways of doing it, aren't there?
There are. There's political choices. And you know what? As a backbencher who's not on the Treasury Select Committee, I'm definitely going to leave it to my Treasury colleagues to make those decisions. And they leave it to me to defend them in studios.
In a couple of years' time, and she might be going stronger on those Treasury colleagues.
Freddy.
Well, I mean, as the years go by, I care less and less about Partygate, much as I admire Alison's journalistic endeavours in exposing it. I mean, there was obviously...
You mean Pepper's?
Sorry?
You mean Pepper Carrera's?
Pippa Credit, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Alison was involved too.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
Team effort.
Yeah, but Pippa got too much credit.
Oh my goodness, I'll take a note of that.
I think that, yes, it was a scandal at the time. It exposed the hypocrisy of the rules and so on. But people increasingly look back on COVID and think, what was all that about? That was all mental. It was a second lockdown really necessary? Was a third lockdown? But all these things... it feels like a period where the government was trying to deal with a very serious problem and didn't know how to. And I don't think people... I know that there are polls that suggest this isn't true, but I don't think people really, really are going to blame Boris Johnson for Partygate forever. They'll blame him for immigration going up so dramatically when he promised it wouldn't. They'll blame him for the economy for inflation. They'll blame him for things like that. I don't think these sorts of scandals hurt a government. I think what's hurting Labour at the moment is a general sense of malaise, and there was a hope among some voters, who clearly now regret it, that Labour would provide some financial stability, securonomics, and so on. And that's obviously not the case.
Well, I do think people are rightly impatient for what they voted for, and I understand their impatience, and we need to be getting on with that, which is why it's important that we're making these commitments on the NHS, which is why it's important for us to create that economic stability and for us to be able to get the economy growing. Those are things that people want. People voted for an improvement in public services. I mean, every single one of my front bench colleagues stands when we go and say, "Oh, I've got an issue in my constituency," on whatever it is, whether it's potholes or social services or schools or GPs or whatever it is, every single one of them will say, yeah. And you'll realise every single time they move the kind of metaphorical rocks that are around in a department, they find things are broken. And it is an enormous, enormous challenge to turn those kind of things around.
That's the challenge of the government, Polly.
We've got to
I've been in government before as a special advisor. I know how difficult
we've got to go to the news. But
during the financial crisis, so I won't
Polly,
take any lessons on that.
Do you not think, though, that looking around that cabinet table, there are so few ministers with any experience of government? And Ed Miliband...
Well, they said that in 97.
Well, I mean, you worked for Ed Miliband, I think, didn't you? I mean, he is one... I was reading Tim Shipman in the Sunday Times yesterday saying, well, he knows how to get things done. He knows which levers to pull to get things done. But there are many around that cabinet table who don't, and it's taking them far too long to learn how to do it.
Well, I think there is always the challenges of how to get used to what government is like. I think that's totally understandable. I think there is also a significant element of the fact that there was all of that chaos and confusion for so long. Some of it, genuinely, as a consequence of dealing with a global pandemic which nobody had to deal with before. And that exhausted the civil servants, let alone the fact that they had bosses who were hauling in a karaoke machine and extra bottles of booze from Tesco rather than getting on with making some difficult decisions.
It was actually a civil servant that did that. But anyway.
That demoralises people too. Well, it demoralises people too, and that makes it much harder for when they're actually asked, look, we need 4 options, and one of them needs to be financially viable at least by lunchtime.
Right, we will take more questions in just a moment to our panel. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:34. News headlines on LBC with Tim Daly.
A 39-year-old man's been charged with sending malicious messages to Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips. It follows criticism she received from Elon Musk about the handling of grooming gang cases. A man's body's been recovered from an area of flooding in North Yorkshire. The news has come after a second region declared a major incident because of accumulating water. And after nearly a decade in office, the Canadian Prime Minister says he's resigning. Justin Trudeau will also be standing down as the leader of the Liberal Party. LBC weather, some clear spells overnight, but wintry showers again for the north and the west. We'll see a low of -3 degrees.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
From bromance to breakup.
And of course, beside him, he's got Elon, who is a proper hero.
The special relationship between Nigel Farage and Elon Musk has turned sour after the tech billionaire took to social media to demand a change at the top of Reform UK. But where does this leave the party? And what of the injection of Musk's millions? And how will President-elect Trump respond to the fallout? Join me, Nick Ferrari, tomorrow morning from 7 on LBC for an exclusive phone-in with the leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global global player, LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Let me reintroduce you to our panel in case you've just joined us. Alison Phillips is a columnist for the New Statesman, former editor of the Daily Mirror. Do you miss the day-to-day? Because I would think being an editor is, I've never been one, but it's such a fantastic job.
It is. It is the best job in the world, where you can wake up in the morning and you think, right, today I'm really angry about this, or I'm really excited about this, and you can just make something
A bit
happen.
like a dictator. Right?
Yeah, very much so.
We know how Elon Musk feels.
I know. Maybe that's my future.
Freddie Gray is deputy editor of the Spectator. Now, of course, new regime at the Spectator, Fraser Nelson. I mean, how long was he there? Like 12, 15 years,
it was
something
15
like that?
years, yeah.
And now Michael Gover's taken over. What change have you noticed?
Oh, it's smooth, brilliant. Everything's gone flawlessly. No, it is going very well. Michael is an experienced journalist, very professional at it. Rather too professional, I think, for some of us. And when he first came,
you're there every day, Freddy.
I know. Have to show up and work. It's dreadful. But when he came, I said to him, "I regard it as our job to make sure that you never work in politics again." And he gave rather a shrill laugh, I thought. So we'll see about that. Yeah.
We also have with us Polly Billington, Labour MP for East Thanet, and Lord Kulveer Ranger, Conservative peer. Right, a text question here from Orla in Beckenham. Is scrapping the gas boiler ban a necessary evil or a sign that we've given up with trying to stop climate change? Now, it's being reported tonight the government is scrapping the ban on the sale of new gas boilers from 2035, which had been introduced by Boris Johnson's government, though house builders will still be prevented from installing gas boilers in new homes, with heat pumps required instead. The government remains committed to reaching net zero by 2050. Alison, let's come to you first on this. I mean, on the face of it, a slightly odd decision.
Well, as I understood it, it's not that it's going to be pushed back rather than completely abandoning the idea of scrapping gas boilers. So it is going to happen at some point. I think, isn't the difficulty that heat pumps are proving to be sort of more complicated and more expensive than people had thought they were going to be. I think there is some really interesting stuff coming down the road around solar panels and other things that are going to help us get towards the net zero. There is obviously some concerns about what this is going to mean for growth and all that work that's going to have to be done if we're going to get to the point that we need our economy to get to. But I do think there is still a commitment to try to get to that net zero as quickly as, should we say, practicable.
Kulveer.
I think people have lost faith in all of this stuff. Was it 2035? Was it 2030? Are we having them? Are we having not? I, over the Christmas period, took the opportunity to take a quote on a heat pump. I think it was £6,000-7,000. I don't have that money lying around. I don't think most people do to change from a gas boiler to a heat pump. Look, I think we've got to refocus on what is the objective that we're trying to achieve here. Net zero is becoming a toxic view to the Joe public about where is this going. People want to understand how they can get value for money for energy, how they can pay their bills, therefore, and then, yes, what is it that there's a long-term plan to get us to reducing CO2, even though, yes, the UK is 1% of global output, because we are in difficult economic times. We do need jobs and growth, and people want to see bills coming down. Now, if we can talk about those things and then how these actions feed into that, I think a government can get cut through. But if we just keep talking about we're changing a timeline on this and we're changing a timeline on that, people don't get the full picture of what is trying to be done here.
I'm very disappointed to hear that from Kulveer, because you worked for Boris Johnson. I don't have much good to say about Boris Johnson, but one of the few things that actually continued to happen while he was Prime Minister, and I know this from the work that I did before I got elected, was he was absolutely committed to keeping going on this agenda. Now, there have been unnecessary switchbacks and so forth on bits of policy, and I'm surprised to hear this, and I do actually think that Alison's right. From what I knew, it was mostly going to be about the 2035 target was about making sure that you don't install them anymore in houses, but those people with central heating will still continue to have the option for a certain amount of time longer. The idea that it's basically the gas industry and existing vested interests are continuing to push the idea that heat pumps won't work. We will need to update.
But they are very expensive, aren't they?
But this is one of the things. If you invest in a technology, those costs will go down over time, and that's what was starting to happen under the last government, but wasn't actually being delivered particularly well. If you do that at scale, street by street, house by house, particularly when you've got whole estates, and that's one of the reasons why it's a good idea to get it done in social housing in particular, you can actually have that kind of transformation that's required, reducing the costs. Now, when it comes to finance, Kulveer's point about not having £6 or £7 grand hanging around, most people don't. But again, this is about making sure that you create the right kind of financial products so that the able to pay, and I think that will probably include Kulveer, would be able to borrow that money.
Of the House of Lords, he gets nothing.
He gets absolutely nothing. Would be able to borrow against the value of the property or whatever in order to be able to pay that back over time. These things have been going on for a long time. We need to stop having any kind of faffing around with what the direction of travel is, and that's why these targets are important, because it sends a very strong message to the market that this is the direction of travel in which we're going, and heat pumps will be the way forward for most people in the future.
We have a comment here on WhatsApp about your performance on the programme so far. Would you like to hear it?
It probably means am I being a gobby bird?
Nikki, I don't know whether she lives in your constituency, says Polly Billington is brilliant. One of your best panellists that you've ever had. She really answers questions unlike the Tory automatons that we've had to put up with. Pretty great.
I hope she gets her money.
I think I went to school with her. Thank you, Nikki.
Well, obviously, I second that. First of all, but I think, scrapping the gas boiler scheme is an obvious win. It wasn't practical. People hated it. It wasn't going to make much of a difference.
This is complete nonsense, Freddy. It was going to happen 5 years in advance. It gives people plenty of notice. There's plenty of opportunity for the industry.
It was unaffordable to most people. It was and is unaffordable to most people, and that's why it should be scrapped. But I mean, the bigger point about net zero is, we hear this a lot from politicians that we've got to be consistent direction of travel and so on. But the problem is they can't do it without having energy costs that are hugely problematic for the government.
The energy costs that are hugely problematic at the moment are oil and gas, because we're dependent on Putin and other despotic regimes across the world. Those are the energy costs that we need to be weaning ourselves off. If we're generating electricity and power and energy here in this country, it's homegrown, it's secure and it's cheaper. That's the direction of travel for this economy, and that's the way we'll have growth.
I don't think people have any faith in Ed Miliband's green revolution. And I think it will end up hurting this government.
It's actually one of our most popular policies, the Great British Energy, because people want to see a government taking responsibility and leading on the direction of travel for our industry, for our economy and for our energy, because they've seen what happens.
Has Great British Energy actually been set up? Because no one seems to know what it's going to do. It's not going to produce any energy, is it?
I am a bit of a bore on this, I'm afraid.
Right. Let's go to a break.
Yeah, exactly. Find something else for me to talk about.
Okay.
Could be here all night.
8:46.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49, Alison, Phillips, Freddy Gray, Polly Billington and Kulveer Ranger with us answering your questions. Mags in South Yorkshire is very exercised about buses. She says people in the poorest parts of the country have suffered the worst cuts to bus services. Between this and the fare cap going up, why don't we take the importance of buses for less well-off people seriously? Now, the IPPR North think tank says the top 10% of the most deprived parts of England have suffered 10 times as many cuts to bus services as the 10% of the most well-off communities. The bus fare cap increased from £2 to £3 across most of England on New Year's Day, though it's remained £1.75 in London and £2 in Greater Manchester, Liverpool and West Yorkshire. Now, I think I'm right in saying there's only one person on this panel who's actually had executive responsibility for buses, and I'm looking at you, Kulveer Ranger.
Yes. Well, I think the executive responsibility sat with TfL, but yes, I was Mayor's Transport Advisor looking at bus policy and how we could deal with actually a hugely growing bus subsidy for a wonderful bus network that we do have and we had in London. And I think the biggest challenge actually we came in 2008 when Boris Johnson became mayor was the bus subsidy had gone from 25 million in 2000 to about 450 million. And it was heading upwards of 600 million by 2010, and we had a problem. Massive expansion, quite rightly, it was a success, but we had bendy buses that weren't fit for our streets. And in fact, I know people were frustrated by it, but the challenge was when we looked at all the routes and we looked at the buses, we found we were paying above the odds on most bus routes. There were sort of double-digit profits being made by bus companies in London compared to outside London. So every time we looked at a route, we renegotiated on the terms of those contracts. And we brought down the price of all of those bus contracts without cutting a single bus. and that's why we changed the face of the network and also brought in the new route master.
That route master is terrible, Kulveer. I'm sorry. I'm
you're the first person who's ever said that.
What's wrong with it?
I'm sure.
What's wrong with it?
Oh, they're terrible. They're really hot and
Better than
sweaty
the bendy
upstairs.
buses.
They're really hot and sweaty upstairs. There's no proper airing, and during the pandemic that was particularly bad. The back door is really unsafe and
meets
dangerous.
all safety
And you are
standards,
swaying
including
around like
EU
this
safety
crazy
standards, which we had to
person.
obey at that
I
point.
loathe them, and it's a real missed opportunity, because getting something which was going to be iconic to replace what was the old route master was a great idea, but having it with such bad design, and I know from having spoken to people who worked closely on this with you and others in City Hall, there was a speeding up of the design, and therefore things got signed off, which really in the long term are
no
not
speeding up of the design. I was there. We had the best British designers around.
Have you sat
Aston
upstairs
Martin,
in the
Norman
back
Foster,
of the route master bus?
and
Anyway.
others, and Sir Pete, Lord Hendy,
The
who
point
led
that
on this
Mags
as well.
of South Yorkshire is making is a very, very important one, because actually the poorest parts of the country are losing out on bus services, and the poorest people use buses much more than the trains. The trains is something that everybody likes to go on about, but fundamentally that is a rich person's way of getting around. It's the buses that make the difference. In communities like mine in Thanet, there is no way of getting from Broadstairs to Canterbury, where our orthopaedic health services are, but directly by bus, or those buses have been cut. We don't have the kind of buses that people have got used to in London, and where you can comfortably see a pair of the realm, like Kulveer, standing next to his cleaner at the bus stop, and both of them getting on the bus. That doesn't happen in communities like mine. It ends up heavily dependent on the car, much worse congestion, and people not being able to get to healthcare, work, and educational opportunities, because we don't have a decent bus service. That's why I'm so excited by what our government is doing, giving powers to local authorities to be able to change their buses and investing in them. We've got the biggest settlement in Kent of the whole of the South East for this. So the challenge to Kent County Council will be whether they will use it properly to transform our bus services.
So
in
you're
a
going to
place
pay
like
tribute
Thanet.
to the county council for getting the best settlement?
Let's see whether they do that. No, they didn't negotiate the settlement. It came from national government. My challenge to them is, are they going to start investing in places like Thanet, which is one of the most deprived parts of Kent, who therefore need buses
No, it is,
more
right.
than many other
No,
places.
absolutely.
You know Kent well.
I know
Exactly.
Thanet very well. Alison.
Yeah, I completely agree with Polly. I think buses, it's an absolute scandal in this country. So when I was editing The Mirror, I was obsessed with this. We did an awful lot of bus stories. And if this was happening in any other form of transport...
The circulation went down.
No, because the readers were interested.
They are.
So, and it is a huge issue. So my uncle and aunt live in Carlisle, big city. They now have no bus routes at all. And as they reach their 80s, they're going to stop driving. They are completely isolated.
Yeah.
They live on the outskirts of a major city. How can this be possible? And I think it's the sort of story that doesn't get enough attention in the media, because a lot of people who work in the media aren't necessarily impacted, and that's why it gets overlooked.
Yeah.
I think everybody in the media increasingly uses buses, because we're all... we
all live in London.
But in London, you've got the tube, so it's all
Well,
different.
I went to the Isle of Wight for Christmas with my family, and our car broke down. And we went to Ryde. We walked into Ryde, a 25-minute walk. And we decided to try and take the bus on the way back, and it was £5 each, including for children.
£5 each?
£5 each.
Terrible.
Which was crazy. And the Isle of Wight is an economically deprived area.
And I know
It's
how
a
much
good
the
example.
Spectator pay.
But somebody very cleverly said about TfL, there's a difference between TfL and almost every other structure of bus provision in the rest of the country, is that TfL is like McDonald's, in that you're very, very clear what the franchise is and you just manage to deliver it or not. And everything else is like Chicken Hut. Right? You've got no idea whether the standards are going to be applied. The prices are all over the place. There's no kind of regulation. So having introduced the bus regulation that we've done and given those powers to local authorities to be able to have the kind of powers, not exactly the same as TfL, but similar to that, will hopefully, I think over time, raise the standards of bus services across the country.
But it isn't part of the problem, even in a lot of poor areas, that people just don't use the buses, that you see them. And when I was in Norfolk, I saw this a lot. And bus services in North Norfolk, let me tell you, weren't particularly brilliant. But you would often see buses going from village to village with virtually nobody on them.
Well, I know, because my in-laws live in Hunstanton. One of the things that we've tried to do is to go and see them by using public transport. But
good luck with that.
I know. Well, exactly, because you arrive in King's Lynn and the bus is already gone, and the next one won't be for another 40 minutes. The integrated nature culture of transport that people are used to in London simply does not exist outside of the capital, and that's what we need. Now, I can bang the drum for Thanet, but you think about places like Leeds. They've been wanting to have a tram or metro system in Leeds since the 1970s, and every single time the short-termism of politics in this country has meant that one of our biggest cities doesn't have a proper metro system.
But I think the thing what we're really talking about, we're not comparing apples with apples here, because personal mobility and the model of personal mobility can't be replicated from a dense inner city to what happens in rural Britain. And I think the challenge, as Iain is quite rightly pointing out here, is that the model of the bus network won't work, because you'll just have an overly subsidised bus network which isn't being used and doesn't then meet the requirements because it's not frequent enough either. So we do have to look at. But if I could just finish it, because I'm going to be the one who's actually going to get worded with you this time, is that we have to look at actually where technology can work here. We've got new systems coming on. We can think of, I hate to say it, but the Uber model of users and services and getting a quality of systems that can actually work in rural, less dense environments is where we need to look. I think, and that's where I hope the government does look, as it looks to change the model of rural public transport. And I think that's what it needs to do, rather than try and replicate dense metropolitan systems.
Well, decarbonise public transport in local areas, in rural areas, will be one of those things which will need to have a completely different model.
Now, I'm debating with myself whether we fit in one more question before we go to the funny question, but unfortunately, it's on Ukraine, and I'm thinking, can you each give an answer in like 45? No, we're not going to do it. So let's go straight to the fun question, which means that you've got a little bit longer than you might normally have. This is from Cara in Leeds. A donkey called Perry, which was thought to have inspired Eddie Murphy's character in Shrek, has died at the age of 30. Who's your favourite TV or film animal? Freddie.
I'm racking my brains because I can't really think of one, but I did think, sorry to turn this all political, but I did think Labour's TikTok video today. Did you see that?
No.
Yes.
It's a sort of, it's animal representations of more policemen on the street. So it's a bulldog, and then it's a kind of bunny, and it's sort of weird and creepy, and it's set to this quite aggressive music. And it turns out this music that they've used, the lyrics, it's a Brazilian rap, and the lyrics are saying very offensive things about giving drugs and doing terrible things to young girls. And I thought this is such a classic thing of what happens when parties try to do social media and get it so spectacularly wrong, that would be my least favourite animals represented. Otherwise, I suppose the Lion King, quite like that.
Alison?
I'm going to go quite cat heavy. So there's the cat in the opening scenes of Coronation Street, which I feel is a stalwart of my childhood, and also cat in Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Okay, Polly?
Oh God, this is really cat heavy, because I was going to say Bagpuss.
Oh yes.
Which who sort of is just sort of lovely. My brother's favourite one when we were little was Danger Mouse, which was great. But my favourite one, I was little, and this probably doesn't really count as a TV character, apart from, of course, there was a film and so forth, is Piglet, because he is that very, actually quite wise friend to a bear of very little brain. And I think we always need somebody like that to hang around with, who gets scared of heiferlumps.
Kulveer.
I'm going to go very modern day, and I have two relatively young children, 6 and 4. I've spent the last 2.5 weeks with Disney Plus on 24 hours a day, because that's all they would allow me to watch. So I would say in third place is the shiny crab from Moana. I love that crab, and I'm very disappointed. He had a very small cameo in Moana 2, which we went to see over the holidays as well. Zootropolis. I love the fox in Zootropolis. If anyone's seen Zootropolis, this fox is just brilliant. But then my number one, and he's a bit of a classic, and it is from the donkey series of Shrek, is Puss in Boots, where Antonio Banderas.
So good.
We're going cat heavy again, but I think he had a spin-off as well of his own.
You've all disappointed me. Maybe it's my age, but I can't believe none of you have picked Skippy the Bush Kangaroo.
Oh, Skippy.
Lassie.
Yeah.
Or Paddington.
Well, yes, there's a classic. Yes, modern-day classic. Oh.
Anyway, thank you all very much for all of your contributions tonight. Now, tomorrow's panel includes another representative from The Spectator. Can you believe it? Cindy Yu, former Conservative MP Vicky Ford, and the political commentator and Lib Dem activist Matthew Hulbert. They'll be here, plus one other. I see there's a gap there somewhere, so we'll have another one for you too. So do let's have your questions in the meantime. In the next hour, we are going to talk about the fact fact that one of the two candidates to be the new